Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know anybody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. Leave us a review and stick afterwards for our descent into the comments section. In the year 885, the Carolingian Empire stood in decline. The unity forged by Charlemagne had fractured under the weight of succession disputes, weak heirs, and the rigid application of Salic law. What had once been a single empire stretching across Western Europe was now splintered into smaller kingdoms, each governed by rulers who lacked the authority, the discipline, or the resolve of their predecessor. By the late 9th century, political fragmentation was complete, and centralized imperial control was a memory. Into this weakened landscape came external pressure. For decades, Viking forces had tested the peripheries of the Frankish world, raiding, extorting, and then retreating. With no coordinated military response and with a succession of short-lived rulers, the Frankish territories had become a reliable source of wealth for Scandinavian raiders. These incursions were no longer opportunistic, they were systemic. The event covered in this episode marked the first time one of these northern expeditions encountered significant, sustained resistance deep within the Frankish interior. It was the first meaningful demonstration that the political center of Western Francia, then not yet known as France, could defend itself without imperial intervention. The defense of the island city served not only as a tactical success, it also revealed the strategic importance of the location that would, in time, become the heart of the French kingdom. More importantly, the decisions made in the wake of the confrontation led directly to the collapse of Carolingian authority. The refusal of King Charles to commit to battle, his eventual surrender to the invading force, and the humiliation that followed accelerated his deposition. Within a year, his dynasty was finished. In its place, a new power base emerged, not one centered in Aachen or Rome, but in the hands of local military leaders who had proven themselves in the field. This was the turning point that allowed the rise of the Capetian dynasty and the shift from empire to kingdom. The events recounted here shaped the political geography of Western Europe and laid the groundwork for the formation of the modern French state. The consequences of this episode can be traced forward not only through the lineage of French kings, but in the very centralization of power in Paris itself, which would go on to dominate the region politically, culturally, and militarily for the next millennium. Let's now experience the Siege of Paris.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 38, The Siege of Paris. From the 25th of November, 885, to October of 886. Parisian forces, 200 men in arms. Nordic Viking forces, roughly 30,000 warriors. The siege didn't just test the walls of Paris, it revealed its worth to all of France. In holding the city, the defenders exposed the spine of the realm. And when Charles the Fat chose appeasement over action, he sealed his fate. The dynasty of Charlemagne ended not with a charge, but with a negotiation. The Carolingians fell because Paris refused to.
When Charlemagne held the reins of Western Europe, the Norsemen of Scandinavia barely scratched the surface of his empire. His grip was firm, his presence too formidable for even the boldest raiders. So the Vikings turned their fury toward the British Isles. They carved paths of destruction there, always watching the Franks from afar, waiting for the moment the shield wall of empire would crack. When Charlemagne died, the crown passed to his son Lothar, a man who inherited the throne, but not the iron will that had forged the empire. With Lothar's passing, Salic law took hold, splitting the realm like a carcass between his three sons. What had been one kingdom became three, not by conquest, but by inheritance. Not one of those sons carried Charlemagne's strength in their spine, or the unity in their blood. They quarreled, fractured, and postured. Meanwhile, the North watched and prepared. The Vikings did what they always did when they smelled weakness. They struck. In 845, the Danes drove their longships straight up the Seine and leveled their fury at Paris. During the 860s, they came again, 3 separate raids, not conquests, but brutal expeditions. They burned, they looted, and they left nothing but ash and blood. Each time they left, it wasn't because they were defeated. It was because they'd taken enough. Silver or slaughter bought them off. The Franks offered no steel in return. And so France became routine, an open purse for the Norse. They returned again and again, not with armies, but with demands. And they got what they came for. The throne changed hands so often it may as well have been passed at a tavern. One weak king followed another, and none brought order. None stopped the bleeding. Charles the Bald fell in 877. His son Louis, known more for a speech impediment than any strength, lasted barely 18 months. By 884, his 2 heirs were dead as well. The crown became a revolving door. Amidst this chaos, the fractured pieces of the old empire were briefly reunited under a single man, Charles the Fat. The bloodline was right, but the man was not. Charles carried royal blood, but none of a soldier's instinct. He was no commander, no warrior, just a name on a family tree. The western reaches, known as Neustria, fell under the rule of men Charles appointed. Paper titles, borrowed power. None of them commanded fear. But between the Seine and the Loire lay the Duchy of France, where one man stood apart, Count Odo. His bloodline would shape the future. His brother's grandson, Hugh Capet, would found a dynasty. But for now, it was Odo who held the line. Odo's father, Robert the Strong, had already bloodied Norse ambitions and raised defenses around Paris. Odo inherited not just walls, but a legacy of defiance. And that legacy, it was about to be tested in full. Siegfried's Danes knew northeastern France well, its roads, its rhythms, and its weaknesses. They'd bled it before, and they'd grown rich doing so. In 885, they came back. This time they didn't come to fight, not at first. They came to name their price, and they expected Charles to pay them off, like all the others had. But Charles said no. So the Danes did what men like Siegfried do when words fail. They reached for the sword. 700 ships, 30,000 warriors. The Seine turned black with their sails. The North had arrived in full strength. Paris in those days was just an island, a fortress in the river. But it stood in the Vikings' path, and it would not let them pass. 2 bridges, 1 stone, 1 wood, linked the island to the mainland. Too low for the Viking ships to slip beneath, each one guarded by a tower. Each tower manned and ready. It was a choke point, and Paris held the throat. Odo had just 200 men, that's all. 200 men against 30,000. Among them were nobles, his brother, 2 counts, and a marquis. But titles meant nothing here. Only steel and nerve would count. And there was Jocelyn, the abbot of Saint-Germain. A man of the cloth, yes, but also a man ready to kill to defend his city. On November the 25th of 885, the longships reached Paris. Siegfried tried to talk once more, one last offer for silver. Odo and his men sent their answer with silence and stone. Siegfried didn't sulk, he acted. By dawn, Viking siege engines were hammering the city. Arrows darkened the sky, and catapulted stones crashed down within Paris. Their first assault hit the northern tower. The defenders met them not just with blades, but with boiling oil that tore through flesh and armor. The Danes melted back, screaming. They tried again and again. Every time the defenders held, the line did not bend. On the 27th, the Danes looked up and saw something new. The defenders had raised the tower another level, overnight, while under siege. That's how badly Paris wanted to live. The Vikings unleashed everything: rams, catapults, fire, tunneling. But Paris stood unbroken. Their fury cracked on its walls. Jocelyn the abbot was no bystander. He put on his helmet, took up his bow and axe, and marched to the wall. He planted a cross where the enemy fire was thickest, and beside him stood his nephew, Eblis, built like a warhorse, fighting like a man possessed. Quote, "Not content with merely exhorting the people, he appeared before them cask in hand, and armed with bow and an axe, planted a cross on the outer defenses, while his nephew Elbas, a man of enormous physical strength, fought beside him." End quote. For 2 long months, the Norse dug in. Trenches, camps, raids into the countryside. They needed food, they needed time, but they weren't breaking through. Then in late January, they tried something different. Desperation breeds creativity. They launched feints, then hurled their infantry at the bridge. They filled the river shallows with branches, logs, dead animals, and human corpses, their own prisoners. They meant to walk across a causeway of rot. 2 days of filth and fury. 2 days of failure. On the 3rd day, the Danes lit 3 of their own ships ablaze and sent them drifting downriver toward the wooden bridge, a floating inferno aimed straight at the city's heart. But the flames faltered. Their ships burned too fast and sank too soon, and the bridge held. Still, the damage was done. Rain poured down in early February, and the swollen river, choked with wreckage, smashed the bridge supports. 1 span collapsed. One of the towers now stood isolated, cut off by water. Only a dozen men held it. The Danes called for their surrender. The defenders answered with steel. 11 fell. 1 was taken, but not quietly. That last man broke free, turned his captors' blades against them, and killed several before he was finally put down. With the bridge down and 1 tower silenced, the Vikings could finally slip past. They left a force behind to keep Paris under pressure and sent the rest upriver. Chartres, Le Mans, towns burned, churches looted, women and children dragged and abused into the dark. The Norse were feeding on France. But Odo wasn't done. He sent messengers out through the Viking lines, silent, desperate men in the night, begging Charles, lounging in Italy, to bring the army north and save the city. And then came hope. Word that Henry of Saxony was marching to their aid. And Odo struck back, launching a sally that broke through the siege and hauled in fresh supplies. The morale inside of Paris surged. Outside the Vikings' ranks began to doubt. Siegfried had seen enough. The siege wasn't breaking the city. His men were growing restless. He named his price, 60 pounds of silver to leave. That was the cost of his pride. By mid-April, Siegfried took his share and sailed off. But not all left. Another warlord, Roland, remained. He had no intention of leaving empty-handed. And then came the blow. In May, disease crept through the city, the kind of sickness that breeds in filth and fear. Jocelyn, the warrior abbot, the soul of the defense, succumbed. With him gone, morale wavered. And Odo made his choice. He wouldn't wait for death. He slipped out himself, through Viking patrols, through danger at every step, and carried his message straight to Charles. On the way back, Odo rallied a few more men to his cause. He fought his way back into the city, sword drawn, delivering news that made the spirits soar. Charles was marching north. Henry of Saxony was coming from the east. But fate turned. Henry never made it, killed before reaching Paris. And Charles delayed, marched slow, waited and waited. Smelling blood, the Vikings launched another assault in the heat of summer. One final push. One last chance to break the walls before help arrived. And again, Paris held. The defenders, starving, sleepless, fevered, refused to fall. They believed help would come. They fought like it had already arrived. In October, the Frankish army finally appeared. Charles's banners crested the horizon. Viking raiding parties were driven back, and Paris breathed. Charles set up camp at the foot of Montmartre. The Danish host was surrounded. The trap had closed. All that remained was the final blow. But France's misfortune was this. The man holding the sword was Charles the Fat. The Norse didn't run, and Charles, seeing that, lost his nerve. He hesitated. The will to crush them vanished. He didn't order the attack, he opened talks. Charles gave them all they had come for: safe passage up the Seine and 700 pounds of silver, paid not in battle, but in shame. Paris was livid. They had held the line, spilled blood, buried their dead, and Charles had bought peace with their sacrifice. Odo spat on the deal. He refused to pay, refused to yield. He would fight to the last man rather than let the Norse slip past him. Odo held the river tight, so the Vikings hauled their ships overland, dragged them with ropes and rage, until they reached the Marne and vanished into Burgundy. That had been Charles's plan all along: send the Vikings toward the rebels. What Charles called strategy, his people called cowardice. Quote, they had been prepared to die themselves in order to hold the rest of the kingdom safe. This safety Charles, with breaking ingratitude, with an almost criminal heedlessness, had bargained away. End quote. In 888, the crown was torn from Charles's head. The empire was divided once again, but this time in two hands deemed worthy. Odo was crowned king of the western Frankish realm. Within 2 generations, Charlemagne's worn-out line was gone, replaced by the House of Capet. A new chapter had begun. Paris proved itself in fire. Its location wasn't just strategic, it was destiny. A city that could choke an army and still stand tall was a city meant to rule. Neither Charlemagne nor Charles had named it capital, but the rivers said otherwise. Whoever held Paris held the arteries of the kingdom. Control Paris, and you control the heart of France. In 889, Odo paid the ransom, not because he was forced to, but because he chose when the war ended. The Vikings kept their word. They never again struck that deep. The Norse settled in the coastal lands that would become Normandy. No longer raiders, they were now neighbors. The Normans had arrived, not as shadows from the sea, but as permanent men of the land. And so Paris stood, not because it was grand, not because it was rich, but because a handful of men chose to make it unbreakable. Odo, Jocelyn, 200 warriors. They stared down 30,000 Norse marauders and didn't blink. They fought on boiling bridges, through plague and siege, through betrayal and starvation. And when their own king, Charles the Fat, handed the keys to the enemy, they still refused to yield. This wasn't just the defense of a city. This was the proving ground for a kingdom. The moment when the future changed hands, from emperors who'd forgotten how to lead, to warriors who still knew how to bleed. Out of this came the House of Capet. Out of this came France, as we would come to know it, because Paris refused to fall, and in that defiance, a new world was born. Thanks for listening. Let's now descend into the killing fields of the comments section. On the Siege of Tobruk, listener Peter Castles 5978 wrote, "The command of Tobruk rarely gets a mention. Morshead was a junior officer under Menashe in World War I. I saw a photo once of Menashe and his entourage, and lo and behold, there was Morshead hanging out of the back. Certainly Menashe has to be right up there with the best. Morshead was a tough so-and-so, despite his outward, mild demeanor. Soldiers who were on the mat in front of him for indiscretions swore that looking into his eyes was like peering into hell. There definitely was no life there. In the early battles around Tobruk, Morshead had every man, including himself, on notice to repel the enemy. So the cooks, batmen, officers, everyone had to shoot until out of ammo, then go in with the bayonet. No retreat, no surrender, and every man there knew it. I often think how surprised the Germans would have been if they had gotten through. It would have been tough going for Erwin all the way. Bye now, Peter." Mr. Peter Castles, thank you for your brilliant comment, and you're right. Morshead doesn't get nearly the recognition he deserves. The focus often rests on Rommel or Churchill, but in that battered, sand-choked corner of Libya, it was Moorshead who set the tone. Calm face, iron soul. He may have been Menashe's junior once, but by Tobruk, he was very much his own man. A commander who led with quiet ferocity. That story about his stare rings true. The man didn't bark, he didn't need to. Every soldier knew where they stood, shoulder to shoulder or not at all. When he said no surrender, he meant it down to the cooks and the clerks. And yes, had the Germans broken through, they wouldn't have found a shattered line. They'd have met bayonets, blood, and the kind of resistance that turns a German advance into a bloodbath. Keep these reflections coming, Peter. They breathe life into the history, and they remind us why these stories still matter. Thanks for listening. See you guys tomorrow.